All right, so picture this. You wake up in a hotel room and you don't know where you are. You look around, see your stuff, but something feels off. You look in the mirror and you don't even recognize yourself.
Yeah.
That's what happened to Jack Kerouac. Our subject for this deep dive, as he describes in The Voice Is All.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah, it's a little spooky, right?
Yeah, definitely sets the stage for what we're looking at today, the Mad Genius Thesis, this idea that maybe, just maybe, there's a link between these bursts of creativity and what we might call mental instability.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Kerouac's life, yeah, it's full of these intense episodes that make you wonder. So how do we figure out if there's any truth to this whole mad genius thing?
Yeah.
We need to understand the man, right? I mean, where did it all begin?
Well, let's go back to his childhood.
Okay.
Lowell, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Not exactly, sunshine and rainbows.
Right.
When he was just 4 years old, his older brother, Gerard, died.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the impact of that kind of loss at that age.
Yeah, I mean, that's heavy.
It is, yeah.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, and it shaped Kerouac profoundly.
Right.
Throughout his life, he carried this sense of guilt, almost like he felt he shouldn't have lived when Gerard didn't. And this feeling of being an imposter, of not deserving his own life, becomes a recurring theme in his writing.
So this early trauma, it's almost like a foundation for his work.
Yeah, it's interwoven with everything.
Wow.
And then you add another layer, his French-Canadian Catholic upbringing. Imagine the tension between his town roots, this working-class immigrant background, and his city aspirations, wanting to break into the literary world, which at the time was very much an outsider's goal.
So he's being pulled in all these different directions, struggling to find his place. That makes his journey to becoming a writer even more interesting.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, what were his early influences? He was a big reader, right?
Oh, yeah, he devoured books. Thomas Wolfe, with his huge, sprawling novels, had a big impact on Kerouac's early writing. You can see that influence in the way Kerouac lets his prose flow, almost like a river. Then there's William Saroyan, known for his almost childlike wonder and celebration of everyday life. You sense that in Kerouac's love for capturing those small, fleeting moments.
He's taking these different styles, almost like ingredients before finding his own recipe.
Exactly.
And then you've got Ernest Hemingway, the master of minimalism, his iceberg theory, where so much is implied but not directly stated. That's almost the opposite of what Kerouac ends up doing.
Right.
Kerouac's style is all about laying everything bare, no holding back.
Right.
So he's drawn to this rawness, this emotional honesty, which is, I mean, that's what we love about his work, right?
Yeah.
But how did he get there? How did he go from traditional prose to this revolutionary style that defined the Beat Generation?
That's where things get really fascinating. He developed this technique he called sketching. Yeah. Instead of meticulously crafting each sentence, he'd let his thoughts pour out onto the page, almost like an artist making quick, impressionistic strokes with a pencil.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did this sketching actually look like?
So imagine Kerouac with this huge roll of paper, feeding it into his typewriter and just typing non-stop, trying to capture the energy and immediacy of his thoughts and experiences. No editing, no overthinking, just pure unadulterated expression.
Wow, that's so different from the way most writers work. It's almost like he was trying to bypass his conscious mind and tap into something deeper.
Exactly. And this is where his relationships, especially with Neal Cassady, become crucial. Cassady was this wild, charismatic figure, the embodiment of life on the road, and he becomes Kerouac's muse, his inspiration.
Cassady, the Dean Moriarty of On the Road.
Yes.
I've always been fascinated by their dynamic. What was it about Cassady that so captivated Kerouac?
Kerouac saw in Cassady this freedom, this impulsiveness, a rejection of societal norms that he desperately craved. Remember that sense of guilt we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Cassady represented a way to escape that, to live fully in the moment.
It's like Cassady held up a mirror to the person Kerouac wanted to be, the uninhibited, free-spirited artist. And their relationship wasn't always smooth sailing, was it?
No, their connection was intense, passionate, but also incredibly volatile. There's admiration, frustration, even jealousy, all these emotions swirling around, fueling Kerouac's writing, and this is where the mad genius idea starts to take shape.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here. But what about other relationships? Did those play a role too?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Kerouac's relationships with women were equally complex. He was intensely romantic, deeply sensitive, but also prone to bouts of self-destruction. There's a pattern of intense connection followed by heartbreak and disillusionment. These themes of love, loss, and longing, They permeate his work.
So these tumultuous relationships, both with men and women, they become part of the creative fuel, the raw material he's drawing from.
Yeah.
But I can't help but wonder about the cost. Was there a price to pay for this level of intensity, this constant emotional roller coaster?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one we'll explore further when we delve into some of the darker episodes in Kerouac's life.
All right, I'm ready to go deeper. Let's see what else we can uncover.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Before the break, we were just discussing how profoundly his brother's death and his cultural background shaped Kerouac's writing.
It's like these early experiences created this wellspring of emotions that he kept drawing from.
Exactly.
But you mentioned some darker episodes, too.
Yeah.
What were those all about?
Well, even as a child, Kerouac had these incredibly vivid dreams and hallucinations. He describes them in his work, these glimpses into what he called a shadowy or supernatural world.
Okay, so he's got this childhood trauma, this cultural tension, and now we're adding visions and hallucinations to the mix.
Right.
Definitely starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah, and then there's the alcohol. It became a constant companion for him, a way to cope with the intensity of his emotions, the pressure of being a writer, the ups and downs of life on the road.
That makes sense. But wasn't alcohol also a problem for him? Didn't contribute to his struggles?
It's a complicated question.
Sure.
Some argue that alcohol fueled his creativity, helped him loosen up and tap into that stream of consciousness style.
Right.
Others say it ultimately held him back, that he could have achieved even more if he hadn't been battling addiction.
It's like a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah.
On the one hand, it might have helped him break free from inhibitions and access those raw emotions. But on the other hand, it clearly took a toll on his health and well-being.
Exactly. And then there's another episode that really adds to the mad genius mystique. His brief stint in a psychiatric ward.
Oh, wow.
He was evaluated by the Navy and given a diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder.
Whoa, hold on. Schizoid personality disorder.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't mental health professionals, what exactly does that mean?
Well, it's a complex condition, but some key characteristics are a detachment from social relationships, difficulty expressing emotions, and a preference for solitary activities. People with this disorder often struggle to form close bonds and might appear aloof or indifferent to others.
Okay, so now we're talking about a clinical diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
That definitely adds weight to this idea of a connection between creativity and mental illness. But we have to be careful, right? We can't just label anyone who's creative and a little bit different as schizoid.
You're absolutely right. A diagnosis is just one piece of the puzzle. And it's important to remember that people are complex and we can't reduce them to a single label. Plus, societal views on mental health were very different back then.
So a diagnosis like that could have carried a lot of stigma.
Definitely.
Which might have made Kerouac's struggles even harder.
Precisely. And this brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the impact of Yvan Lemaitre's critique of Kerouac's work.
Right.
This wasn't just a literary critique. It was deeply personal and touched on his identity in a way that really shook him.
Remind us about Lemaitre and her criticism. What was it about her words that hit Kerouac so hard?
Lemaitre was a respected Franco-American intellectual.
Okay.
She accused Kerouac of neglecting his heritage, of trying to distance himself from his French-Canadian roots to fit into the predominantly white literary world.
Ouch. That must have stung.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she was saying he was betraying his own people, his own identity.
And for Kerouac, who was already grappling with feelings of guilt and inauthenticity, this criticism really struck a nerve.
It's almost like he was caught between two worlds.
Yeah.
Trying to reconcile his working class, immigrant background with his aspirations to be a successful writer. That's a lot to carry.
It is. And instead of dismissing Lemaitre's critique, Kerouac took it to heart. He started to explore his Franco-American heritage more deeply in his writing, almost like he was trying to reclaim that part of himself.
So this criticism, even though it was painful, became a catalyst for growth. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And didn't this all happen around the same time he was developing his sketching technique and working on the road?
Yes, it's like all these threads, the childhood trauma, the cultural tension, the personal struggles, the artistic experimentation, they all converged around this time. And boom, On the Road is born.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
It's like his life was this pressure cooker of experiences.
Yeah.
And On the Road was the release valve.
Yeah.
But I'm still curious about how his mental state played into all of this.
Yeah.
Was he having a breakdown? Was he self-medicating? Was it all part of the creative process?
That's where the Mad Genius Thesis gets really interesting, because there are no easy answers. It's not a simple case of he was mentally ill, therefore he was creative. It's much more nuanced than that.
So how do we make sense of it all? How do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory elements of his life? The brilliance, the darkness, the triumphs, the struggles.
Well, that's what we're going to explore further as we move into the next part of our discussion. We'll delve into the legacy of On the Road, the impact it had on both literature and culture, and we'll continue to grapple with this question of whether genius and madness are two sides of the same coin.
All right, I'm hooked. Let's take a quick break and then dive back into the heart of the Mad Genius Thesis. We're back and ready to tackle the legacy of On the Road, and more broadly, Kerouac's impact on literature and culture. It's wild to think about how one book written in a frenzy on this continuous scroll of paper could have such a massive ripple effect.
Yeah, it really is. It's a testament to the power of Kerouac's voice. He tapped into something raw and essential, something that resonated with a whole generation yearning for authenticity and freedom.
So let's zoom out for a second. Why did On the Road become such a cultural phenomenon? I mean, yeah, it's a great book, but was there something more at play?
Well, remember the context. It's the 1950s post-World War II America, the country's booming, but there's also this underlying sense of unease, a feeling that the American dream isn't all it's cracked up to be. People are looking for something more, a deeper meaning beyond material success.
And Kerouac, with his tales of cross-country adventures, jazz poetry pushing boundaries, offered an alternative.
Exactly. He captured the zeitgeist perfectly. His characters, Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty, embodied this yearning for something beyond the conventional, the prescribed path. They were searching for truth, for experience, for a way to live life on their own terms.
It's like he gave a voice to a whole generation that felt stifled, that was craving something more authentic, more real. But beyond the cultural impact, what about Kerouac's influence on other writers?
His style was revolutionary. The stream of consciousness confessional style, it broke all the rules. He wasn't afraid to be raw, vulnerable, to lay bare his soul on the page.
It's funny because now that style seems almost commonplace, but back then it was groundbreaking.
Oh, absolutely. He paved the way for a whole new generation of writers who weren't afraid to experiment, to break free from the constraints of traditional literary forms. Think about the beat writers who followed in his footsteps. Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, they all owe a debt to Kerouac.
Like he blew the doors open and said, hey, you can write about anything you can write in any way you want. Just be true to yourself. And that's so inspiring, even today.
And you know what's interesting? Kerouac's work feels even more relevant now in our hyper-connected, always-on world. His message of simplicity, of living in the moment, of finding beauty in the everyday, it almost feels radical in today's context.
I totally agree. In a world obsessed with technology, consumerism, achieving the next big thing, Kerouac's emphasis on slowing down, experiencing life fully, and connecting with something deeper feels like a breath of fresh air.
And that's the power of the Mad Genius, I think. They see the world differently, they feel things more intensely, and they're able to articulate those experiences in a way that resonates with us on a deep, almost primal level.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Kerouac's life and work, and this whole idea of the Mad Genius Thesis, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the key takeaway is to appreciate the complexity of the human experience. Kerouac's story shows us that brilliance and darkness can coexist, that creativity can flourish even in the midst of struggle. It's not about romanticizing mental illness or glorifying suffering, but rather recognizing that the human spirit is capable of incredible resilience and creativity, even in the face of adversity.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to creativity, to life, to anything, really.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most profound art comes from those who have walked through fire and emerged on the other side transformed.
Exactly. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep challenging your own assumptions about creativity and the human condition.
And thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life and work of Jack Kerouac and the Mad Genius Thesis.
Until next time.